Hello, everyone. It is Professor Amamoto, and the date is August 3rd, 2025. The, the time is 4 o'clock, 4 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Welcome, one and all. I have an exciting talk for you today. It's going to be based on, or I should say more properly, inspired by a recent publication by a former district attorney, assistant district attorney at Orange County, titled The Book of Murder, subtitled A Prosecutor's Journey Through Love and Death. And from what I understand, it's selling very, very well. There's a link below if you want to click on and purchase the book. This one gets 5 stars. I recommend it. It belongs in your library. And I'm not going to have the time to go through all the finer points of the book. That's why I said this talk is inspired by this book. That is, I'll be going off on my own, hopefully productive tangents in talking about true crime in the county of Orange, California, the United States of America. And I'm going to be going into directions that longtime listeners of this channel will recognize, but without repeating. I'm building on previous coverage that I've done over the past 5 years and adding it to this evolving storehouse of knowledge and analytical approaches to understanding society, culture, and politics. And we're doing it via attempting to understand true crime. That's how I'm approaching it. So let me very quickly review the resume of Mr. Matt Murphy. He joined the Orange County District Attorney's Office in 1993, and he advanced through the ranks, and eventually he wound up with a highly sensitive and prestigious position in the homicide wing of the larger DA's office. And as I recall, there's only something like 7 attorneys that work these homicide cases. And typically they're high profile cases. They're sensitive. They're politically sensitive. The public is watching like a hawk. And this goes back years. It's even more acute now where we have a situation that we have these amateur sleuths and pop-up pundits, as well as established journalists, bona fide journalists, who are covering this burgeoning field of true crime. I myself have been at it for decades now. And my specific contribution is, I'll tell you right up front, is emphasizing the militarist, political, economic, cultural, social fabric of militarism in the United States of America. This is why we're the kings, the champions, let's say, of serial killing and mass murder. It's an extension of our history going back to colonial days. And this is why there's no other country that even rivals anywhere close to what the United States has dubiously accomplished over the decades, especially after World War II. It started to accelerate, and I've explained in previous talks why possibly there's been an acceleration of this type of crime, and other people have chimed in. I advise you just to go back to some of these earlier talks if you want some information. I will send this to my Patreon people, a new article that I found or rediscovered in prepping for this particular talk that you might find useful. I'm going to put it in Patreon attachment. It's called The Lead Crime Hypothesis, a meta-analysis. This is empirically based research. It's not just people talking out of their you-know-what. This is social science, forensic science at its finest, what from what I can tell. I'll let you evaluate it. That's going to go to my Patreons, which you'll want to subscribe if you're a serious investigator, or if you're just casually interested in the topic. You'll find all kinds of goodies in my Patreon page. I have many satisfied supporters, and I thank you very much, my Patreon reporters, for allowing me to purchase books right off the press. This is a 2025 publication. All right. So he joined almost right out of law school. He took a few months off. I guess you could call it a gap year. Oh, well, he's a hardworking guy. A gap year between, I think it was college. He went to the University of California, Santa Barbara, by the way. I think he spent 9 months surfing because it's very clear in the book that his passion outside of prosecuting the bad guys, which we all hate. That's why I think, at least for me, that's why I'm so interested in true crime, because we want to see justice in our lives, right? We want to see some sort of resolution to some of the more heinous atrocities that have been committed by our fellow human beings. Ostensibly they're human beings. Sometimes I wonder. And I mentioned UC Santa Barbara because I think it comes out in the book. He feels a little perhaps diminished by the fact that he came out of, and he need not be. That's what I'm trying to say here. He feels like he's in a kind of subordinate in the hierarchy of law school graduates. He's subordinate to the big boys who graduate from the Ivies or the University of Chicago or maybe even Stanford, who go on to become law school professors. That's the A list, right? And then the B list is the people who get the jobs with let's say, the Southern District of New York, like James Comey. And then his daughter, Maureen Comey. Look, I'm just mentioning them because they're in the news lately. People of that ilk, those are the ones that get the real plum position, but the really grassroots, grind it out type of prosecutorial expertise is done by people like Matt Murphy, and he comes from the University of San Diego. It's an ABA accredited law school, which means he doesn't have to take the first year examination called the baby bar. But it's not a prestige institution. It's not a UC. Well, I don't know if you call. Yeah, Berkeley's up. I think Berkeley's in the top 10. University of Virginia is also up there. So he mentions that, and and I'm sensitive to it because I come from that world. So I'm reading his motivations and his sort of underdog mentality when he's fighting on our behalf, the public, on our behalf, to bring these miscreants to justice. And yes, I know some of them deserve death. I'll agree with you there. And Matt Murphy is a proponent. He says it right up front. You know, he's very open about it. He is a death penalty proponent. Okay, so he gets that out there in front, but he respects people who, for moral, ethical, religious grounding, says, no, thou shalt not kill. Although a more accurate translation of one of the 10 Commandments is, thou shalt not murder. Anyway, I'm not going to play Talmudic scholar at this point, but I'm saying that all these different elements go into what I think is a really fine insight into the prosecutor's art. It's a science. Yes, we know that. It's evidence, and you have to have empirical evidence. He talks about some of the innovations like the CODIS program, all caps, CODIS, CODIS, which helped to bring more convictions and argue cases more successfully in front of juries in death penalty cases, which is like you're really on the high wire there. your material, your case has to be as airtight as you can, right? So we're getting an inside look at the artistry behind the nuts and bolts that we're more familiar with from watching anywhere from the old days, Perry Mason, to some of these films that romanticize and glorify prosecutors or defense attorneys, or following true crime. I did a talk recently on Dominic Dunn, his new biography, critical biography, which is excellent. And I've been on this thread for the last few weeks here. I'll be branching out into other areas pretty soon, but I feel that some of these issues that are actually, they're more discoveries that I have come across in thinking about these issues need to be shared now for current and future researchers. For example, I have been advancing an argument regarding the murder of the 4 undergraduate students at the University of Idaho that I haven't seen anywhere. So if you'll hang with me to the end of this talk, I will share that with you towards the end. I'm hitting all the important information up front, and then I won't say it's lesser important, but the ones that I can say for next week, I'll do later in this talk. But I want to get this out into the public mind right now. There might be some researchers who are watching this, right? Some bona fide journalists, not the pop-ups, not the ones that are applying makeup while they're talking about grisly topics or rotten mango or some of these. I'm talking about real journalists, people like Brian Enton, who I respect, people like Ashley Banfield. There's some other, I even have to give Nancy Grace a little bit of, on a personal level, she's horrific, but she is a certifiable professional, and she's been at it. She's not a newbie, okay? So I want to get this information out into the discussion. And I'm saying this because this is probably one of the more important contributions of books like this, people who have been in the trenches. Because we have all these armchair observers, some of these click and shoot at the hip type YouTube sensationalists, right? But he's been there, all right. And he also, I came to this understanding after reading this book and thinking about it. He, talking about Matt Murphy, served an important political function that's not recognized by the formal branches of government, judiciary, legislature, executive, or even the police department, the sheriffs, the marshals. But he represents a public opinion, but he's someone who's been at the trenches, and he can speak with gravitas and authority. And of course, needless to say, a storehouse of direct experience prosecuting some of the most sensational cases that you can imagine, all happening in the idyllic utopian region called Orange County, California. I'm saying I'm being ironic here because it's not a utopia, far from it. There's a reason why the master storyteller of futuristic dystopia, Philip K. Dick, moved from Northern California to Orange County. He moved to Santa Ana in the latter part of his life when he started to gain notoriety. There's a reason why he was relocated to Orange County to chart and to project the cultural, sociological changes that were being engineered into this very important region in the United States within the military industrial serial killer complex, Orange County. Now, of course, Matt Murphy doesn't see it that way. This is my contribution to this evolving discussion. All right. There's tons of aerospace, communication, military industrial corporations from Hughes to smaller contractors in Orange County. When I was growing up, almost all my friends' dads worked at one of these companies. My mother even worked for one. She was in the customer relations. She started in very entry level assembly because we were still manufacturing what's now called high tech back in Orange County. Orange County was Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley, right? I'm just trying to tell people who grew up there know what I'm talking about, but I'm just trying to bring people up to speed whose vision of Orange County is from watching the Real Housewives of Orange County, or maybe you're from Los Angeles and you feel a little bit superior to those of us who have lived experience behind what you used to call the orange curtain, because Orange County used to be referred to as John Birch Society land. All right, it was supposed to be hyper conservative. It used to be, once upon a time, and it still is. At its core, it is, because it's corporatist. It's military corporatist. It's conservative of a militarist corporatist power structure. So in that sense, it's conservative. But so far as the cultural and social part of it is, that's way over. All right, so just get that out of your mind. I just want to get that off the table when we talk about this, so that you'll be more open to some of the observations I will be offering for you today. But first of all, before I continue with my long-winded introduction, let's take a glimpse of what most people think of when they hear Orange County. Well, they might think of Disneyland first. That was the original amusement park of the Disney franchise. It was in Anaheim. I worked right across the street at Sambo's Pancake Restaurant in Anaheim all through high school. I earned $1.65 an hour, and I saved up enough to buy my first decent guitar, a Fender Telecaster, which I still have, by the way. It's still my best instrument. All right. So I have a very, very close relationship to almost every single area within North, because it's a huge and large, geographically spread out county from north to south, east to west. And I say north to south because usually the breakdown is north is more solidly middle class, working class, and there's even some sort of ghetto type situations there. And the south is what most people associate Orange County with as being affluent, upper middle class, professional, and wealthy people, celebrities, actors. Kobe Bryant his main home was in Newport Beach. He and his wife had to get on their helicopter and motor over, I guess it's about 60 miles over to Calabasas or wherever it was, to reach the Kobe Bryant athletic place. And I think Ohtani Shohei still lives in Newport Beach. Okay, these are just a couple of people that come to mind, but there's actors, celebs galore. Michael Francisi, or he calls it Francis. Sorry, I accidentally give it the more appropriate Italian pronunciation. He said, I'll pronounce it the way he wants it. Michael Francis lives in Newport Beach. All right. I lived over the hill in the poorer section. I lived in Irvine for about 7 years. In the poorer section of Irvine, they called zero lots. They're kind of like condos. But there's some expensive real estate over there. But, I'm in that zip code, but I'm not living like that. Because, when the Pacific Palisades, there were some people there who were just working class. Their families set down roots in the 40s or 50s, and they just were hanging on, as all the affluence came in more and more so. And of course, then they were burned out. That's all part of the plan. That's a different talk at some other point. But I lived over the hill. I was in Tustin, lived in Costa Mesa, spent some of my childhood, as I already mentioned, in Anaheim, and I drove all over the place. So I'm very well acquainted. And I used to go to Laguna Beach. And as long as you weren't there at nighttime as a non-white person, and I'm yellow if you haven't noticed, it might be slightly better now, but it's still about a 99% white community. They might have a few yellows, maybe some Asian women who have white husbands or something, but it's I wouldn't call it a racially or ethnic diverse community. And I mention this because I had students and I had family who've been rousted by the Laguna Beach cops, and they were Asian, right? They were busted for DWA. It's called driving while Asian. And maybe there's a reason for that, because there's also a gangster subculture in some of the North Orange County areas, places like Westminster, Garden Grove, parts of Huntington Beach, which I'm also well acquainted with. So here's Laguna Beach.
Laguna Beach is a small coastal city that occupies just under 9 square miles of land and has a year-round warm and moderate climate. It's located in southwest Orange County and is almost exactly between Los Angeles and San Diego, with Los Angeles being about 50 miles north and San Diego about 60 miles south. Laguna Beach has a population of just over 23,000, but brings in more than 6 million visitors every year. There are several things that attract people to Laguna Beach, with one of them being its more than 30 beautiful cove beaches that stretch out over 8 miles of its coastline. The main beach, located in the center of town, has a small boardwalk with basketball courts and the iconic lifeguard tower.
Okay, you have an overview of the setup south of Laguna. Is it south or north? Surrounding Laguna Beach. Laguna Beach is really, really tiny. And by the way, I've been up, there's also some foothills up there, and I've spent a lot of time up there because, believe it or not, see, I went to grad school at UC Irvine, which is on the other side of the hill. This is in Irvine. This is why I was living in Irvine primarily. And I had some professors who lived in Laguna Beach up in the hills because they got hired, let's say in the mid 60s or the late 60s, perhaps. It was still expensive, but it was a lot cheaper. And they had premium homes. So I kind of got an idea of the layout, the lifestyle. And I've had also some friends who live in Newport Beach in the area. Spent some time. There's Balboa Island, which is very much related. Further south is Dana Point, Corona del Mar. When President Richard Nixon retired, he retired down in Corona del Mar area. In fact, they have what they call the Western White House. That was his headquarters down this area. So you get an idea of the affluence and the political power that's involved there. By the way, also Laguna Beach, it reminded me, there's a Laguna Canyon that goes from the Pacific Coast Highway, Highway 1. There's the Pacific Laguna Canyon Drive. It goes right up through, and it ends up in Irvine. It's kind of like a shortcut if you want to take the freeway. It's a 2-lane road, or at least it was when I used to take it. So it's slow going. And I used to teach at the Laguna Art Institute. I taught a couple courses there. I was just doing some moonlighting. And a lot of the kids that were going there were from the area because they were from wealthy families going to an art school because they didn't know what else to do. And I heard some pretty wild stories about some of the retired celebs that were living in Laguna Canyon. People thought, oh yeah, the not Topanga Canyon, but Laurel Canyon. There's all kinds of places like that. It just so happens that once a certain meme gets thrown out there by the intelligence agency, Laurel Canyon, then all the pop-up pundits, that's all they can talk about, right? But why don't you, on your own, why don't you start checking out Laguna Canyon and see what you can find? There were a lot of musicians there too. It was an artist colony, not just music, but crafts, painting, you name it. So this gives you an idea of the community we're talking. And these are the types of communities like that people in the DA's office had to cater to, right? Because they can deal with the riffraff in Garden Grove, which we used to call Garbage Grove. We apologize for that. Or some of the riffraff and some of these other orange county, because it's working class. But if you want to talk about crimes that are being committed off Newport Beach, then you're dealing with a certain social type, and you want a Matt Murphy. He's a surfer type. He's not a surfer type. He is a surfer. He went to UC Santa Barbara, for goodness sake. And he mentions himself that every time he would confess to his colleagues that he went to UC Santa Barbara, they would just kind of nod knowingly, sneering, not quite sneeringly, but it's, gamemanship, like I'm better than you. I went to Berkeley because it's known as a party school, and it still is. I grew up. That's what's always been my image. I've been there many, many times. It's one of the most beautiful college or university campuses you ever want to visit. It's right on the Pacific Ocean. Pepperdine it's on Malibu coast. That's the newer campus. It's pretty lush, and Irvine is coming along too, but it's not oceanfront property. So this is the clientele that Matt Murphy has to deal with, and they're demanding, and they want their justice. We want the little people. We want our justice too. But if we want to be honest about it, I don't think Matt Murphy would say this, because now he's a network and a independent media consultant and expert, as we'll see in a moment. But there's different tiers based on your social class of justice in the United States of America. Right. Nonetheless, that's not to say that he's not working his butt off trying to look after the interests of all the victims, including a 23-year-old, I think she was, woman. She was a fellow yellow, Julie Kubiishi, I think her name was. I can't remember. Let me see. I wrote her name. Yeah, Julie Kubiishi. She was murdered by this miscreant, this wannabe actor. And I'm interested whenever yellows become victims of these violent crimes, because typically they're never mentioned. For example, the so-called incel killer, right? Our friend down at UC Santa Barbara, he wasn't even a student at UC Santa Barbara. I think he was trying to transfer there, right? His roommates, 3 of them were yellows. But we don't hear anything about them. We do hear about the frat girls who were killed and shot. Yeah, that's awful enough, right? Just like we hear about the frat girls and the frat guy at the University of Idaho, because they're what's called by one theorist worthy victims. But at the same time, there was a recent killing in Los Angeles by the son of the guy who used to run the Miss America pageant, who killed his yellow wife. They found her corpse in a trash bag, and they still haven't found the bodies of her 2 Chinese parents. We don't hear anything about that. Brian Enton, where are you? Ashley Banfield, are not yellow bodies worth anything to you? And the reason why I mention it's not gratuitous here. not gratuitous at all, because we will see, as in the case of the of Richard Ramirez, the so-called Zodiac killer, his targeted victims were yellow people from San Francisco to LA through parts of Orange County. And it so happens that that was one of his, talking about Matt Murphy's cases, the Zodiac killer. Let's see. Well, before we get into the Zodiac killer, again, this is another reason why people like him, who have been in the trenches, who are writing from a position of experience, are so valuable to us as the people's advocate, because we don't have access. I'm talking about the little people. Believe me, I do not identify with the ruling class. That always gets me. People, well, gee, you taught at the University of California. You're in the elite. How deluded is that? That is way out of, far from the truth. Some of them there really believe that. They act like they're super special, but they're not. They're allowed to act, or they get to play act that they're special, but they're not. Okay. So Matt Murphy will is a voice there in the public media, independent or network, for us. That's how I view him. And from what I read, and I take his words seriously, and I believe he's a sincere individual. He's committed. I mean, who's going to work in the DA's office for almost 25 years doing such ungodly work, where he could be raking money in DC? I mean, if he had gone to Yale or Columbia or something, he could be in DC making tons of money by doing nothing, or on Wall Street raking in $500,000 for doing nothing, in addition to all the different. So from a sheer monetary perspective, he's not raking in the money. All right. And he's put the dues in. So he doesn't need any approval from me, but so far as I'm concerned, he's paid his dues, right? And this is a person I'm going to pay attention to when he's writing the war. I'm not going to be paying attention to some pop-up pundit who speaks in vocal fry and looks like she's 15 years old and she's an expert on Brian C. Koberger. Those people don't have any standing in my world, and they shouldn't have any standing in your world unless you are like them, which is what they depend upon. Because like is attracted to like, right? So here's Matt Murphy. He's being interviewed by, she's a born-again conservative, for the people, populist Megyn Kelly. But, I have a long memory. I remember when she was an antagonist of You and Me. She was the antithesis of populists, but she's changed her stripes, just like Andrew Cuomo, or Chris Cuomo, I'm sorry, is changing his stripes. Joanne Reed supposedly is now pretending to be a conservative because they've lost all credibility. They're trying to get on the winning team. Sort of like the paperclip scientists. They said, well, the whole Nazi thing didn't work out. I guess we'll start working for the U.S., building weapons of mass destruction. So does that make the paperclip scientists trustworthy? Because now they're down in Huntsville, Alabama, working for the red, white, and blue? No, they're still criminals, man. So here is Matt Murphy being interviewed by the one and only Megyn Kelly about, well, this is several months old. This is when Kamala Harris was still trying to weasel her way into elective office for the presidency, for goodness sake. My gosh. Imagine if we had President Kamala Harris. Anyway, the point is that She was advocating for the public funded sex reassignment surgery for people in prison. And I said, wow, that story reminds me of an earlier one, which I'll get to in a moment. Let's see how Matt Murphy comes down on this question of publicly funded transsexual surgery for prisoners, people who have committed violent, heinous crimes.
I've got to ask you about this case. It's all over the news right now. This was your case. Team Trump has realized in the waning days of this campaign that the insanity that's happening with respect to women's rights versus trans rights is a very hot election issue. You're starting to see this issue with, in particular, Democrats being on the wrong side of this, raised in the Texas Senate race, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and at the presidential level between Trump and Harris. He's got an ad running in almost every NFL game, reminding people that Kamala Harris both wrote explicitly that she's in favor of taxpayer-funded sex change operations for prisoners and for illegal immigrants, and that she's on camera bragging about having done it in California. And you were the prosecutor of the one man in particular who's been in the news thanks to the Free Beacon, which raised this, who she basically, I mean, he can thank his taxpayer-funded sex change operation in California to Kamala Harris. He can thank her for it. He's the so-called yacht killer serving a life sentence, and he got a taxpayer-funded sex change surgery thanks to her. His last name is Jacobson. Can you tell us about this case?
Yeah, his birth name is Jacobson. His actual name, he changed it, is Skylar De Leon, and that's what he's known as. So, yeah, quick rundown on this. This is a guy who, this is one of the worst murders that I'd ever seen, that I ever encountered in my 17 years exclusively of doing homicide cases. Essentially what he did was there's a couple named Tom and Jackie Hawks who retired and bought a yacht called the Well Deserved. And their dream was to sail up into the.
I'm sorry for cutting it short, but I have to pack in a lot more material. If you want to read more about the murder and how this, well, he wasn't a tranny at the time. He became a transsexual in prison, thanks to Kamala Harris and the taxpayers of the state of California, of which I am one. You could read about the case of the Hawks couple. But as nice as people as you can imagine, who just wanted a peaceful retirement. And this guy, I mean, the whole circumstance of their setup, and their bodies are never found, by the way. He never revealed where they were, so his job as a prosecutor was all the more difficult. But he was brought to justice. But then when he got into prison, you saw the results. He became a woman. So this reminded me, because I've been reading in this area for decades now, it reminded me the case of one Richard Speck. Does that ring a bell? Probably not. I'm not blaming you because we're inundated with these names by now. But when he was committing his atrocities, and when he committed his atrocity, this is back in 1966. I was a kid. I was a child, but I used to read the Los Angeles Times every morning with my parents. So I followed it. And this type of crime was rare back in the day. Like I've alluded to earlier, it's only been accelerating. And there's a book written about it. I think I've given a talk about this over the previous 5 years. It's called The Crime of the Century. It's called Richard Speck and the Murders That Shocked a Nation. He was convicted. Again, it was an incredible trial. And notice the victims. They put the pictures up here. Most of them are Filipinas. Remember I said a lot of the victims here, the unworthy victims, are Asian people? Well, it's part of the imperial wars going back to the Spanish America. Did you realize that America was at war against the Philippines at one point? It's called the Philippine-American War. We don't learn that in school. And that's one of the reasons why these women were coming to the U.S. as nurses. They're still coming in large numbers, and there's a backlash against them, by the way. If you go to the hospital, you go to the doctor's office, you'll see there's lots of Filipinos who are nurses. That's part of the history of the colonial process here. So this guy, Richard Speck, went in there and murdered a number of these nurses in their dormitory. Okay, that's one part of the story. But then a news reporter went into the prison situation based on the lead, and they found out that, guess what? Richard Speck was being transitioned to being a woman, just like this guy, Skylar De Leon. And this was in the late 60s. Here's the report from local Chicago news.
Tonight, Richard Speck speaks. All week long, we have been showing you some disturbing images of the mass murderer. We heard Speck confess and show absolutely no remorse for his heinous crimes. Tonight, our series of reports is resulting in a call for action. Today in Springfield, lawmakers asked for an investigation. They want to know how Speck could make a videotape behind bars and how he appears to have free reign even though he was in prison. We'll be following lawmakers' actions, and we'll have more on that tomorrow. But tonight, what you're about to hear and see may be the most outrageous images of all. Bill Curtis joins us now with more. Bill.
And I think you'll find the word outrageous an understatement, Linda. We certainly advise sending your children out of the room for the next 5 minutes. During the last 3 nights, we've heard Richard Speck talk about the murders of 8 young women without remorse. Tonight, we look at Speck's life in jail, and it provides rare insight into a culture behind bars, one we've heard about but have never seen.
Oh, God.
This is Richard Speck in Illinois' Stateville prison, having what amounts to a party with his pals. This tape was made in 1988, 3 years before Speck's death. During the last years of his life, Illinois' most famous inmate appears to have had the time of his life behind bars, something Speck is quite proud of. This incredible video of Speck's last years in prison begs the question, how was this ever allowed to happen?
And he's kind of a weak-minded person anyway, and easily influenced.
Martin Shiflett was a guard at Stateville for more than 30 years. One of his duties? Keep a close eye on Speck. During his early years in Stateville, Speck...
Okay, you see that Richard Speck was transforming into a woman. From what I read in this book, he was taking feminizing hormones, estrogen, so that he can be more effectively a prison bitch for all the black studs who were there. And then, thanks to real journalistic investigation that was going on back in those days, when the network still had some credibility, they stopped the practice. They exposed. That's what the press used to do. This is what journalists used to do when I was growing up. And now they're working for George Soros or Larry Fink or somebody who is a globalist kingpin, and they call that news. But hey, we have us and we have independent minds. And now he's a writer. He's getting all the information. People like Matt Murray. We want to encourage this. And if you have comments, please put them down here if you want to share your thoughts. Keep forgetting to mention that, because this is a community effort that we're engaged in. So let's see our man further in action, Matt Murphy, talking about this is an earlier case of his, prosecuting the so-called a dating game killer. The press has these cute names attached to them. I'm just putting them out there, following suit, okay? But it's Rodney James Alcala. Here we go.
Showed up by himself It's Camacho's very first day back on the job. He'd been shot in the Watts riots, and he'd been shot in Vietnam. He was in the Army of Vietnam, so the guy's been shot twice. And his first day back at work, he gets that call. And he arrives by himself, and he knocks
I'm going to speed it up.
on the door, and the guy had been gutted twice. Now it is 2002. I, having been 12 years old then, I've gone to college, gone to law school, gone through the DA's office, and it lands on my desk. Okay. And I go in, and my boss at the time was a guy named Lou Rosenblum, who was my mentor, living legend in the prosecution world. And Lou, I'm like, what do we do with this? Now, I can't use any of the new evidence that has been disapproved of. So the original case has now been gutted twice. And I'm like, what do I do with this? I got a composite that I think is very convincing. And I got Lori Wirtz, but all of this other evidence, including 4 suspected murders in New York, shocking, right? And all this other evidence that was admitted in the first trial, I can't touch any of it. So, and I love this, Lou leans back, and again, he was just swearing. He goes, you know, some of these people, and he'd done a whole tour in homicide, he did 67 murders, he won every single one of them. So it's impossible. He did it in 12 years. Leans back and he goes, some of these guys are so evil, I would rather they beat me than ever agree to them being released. And then he looks at me and he goes, if I were you, I would say, fuck that guy. So I think I'm going to take a run at it no matter what, right? So I find a guy in the Navy, a Navy expert on the sun, and those things exist, okay, who is able to look at those shadows and give me an exact time that that photo was taken, which made Rodney Alcala perfectly in Huntington Beach exactly when he needed to be. And the Court of Appeal reversed it because his previous lawyer didn't introduce a BS alibi defense that he was supposedly at Knott's Berry Farm. So I've got this, I got my Navy guy, I've got Lori Wirtz, and I've got that composite, and I'm ready to roll. And then DNA catches up to Rodney Alcala. And we start getting DNA hits from people in Los Angeles County, from old unsolved murders from the mid-'70s, beginning with this woman, Charlotte Lamb, who was one of the many women that moved to LA to pursue a career in acting and modeling. And this woman, based on all of meeting her family and all of her neighbors, she was more beautiful on the inside than she was on the outside. And she had a neighbor who I put on to talk about when she left her apartment the night she was murdered. And this man was, in the days before computers, he would have been a gamer today. And I can say that because I embarrassingly played way too many video games myself. But he was this really sort of not too social, just kind of a nerdy guy. And she was so nice to him, she would always invite him out because she thought he seemed lonely. And this man, 30 years later on the stand, broke down in tears when he was talking about Charlotte Lamb. Jill Barcombe was 18 years old, and I'm going to show one graphic photo here, and it's not too bad.
Well, I saw this clip before, and I don't want to show it again. I will put a link on my X account to this talk. I think it's worthwhile watching him give a full-blown I guess it's a PowerPoint, a slideshow of some of the more spectacular cases he's done. He's also written about them in more detail in this particular book. Now, what I found interesting, this is my gloss on his discoveries, Matt Murphy's. What I found interesting is that through and he had a whole team of investigators. He gives them all their kudos, and he states their name, puts it down in there, who contributed, right? He shares the glory with a whole team of people. But what they did is they found a whole trove of photographs taken by Rodney James Alcala that was in a storage unit way up in Seattle. And this is in Los Angeles. This is in Orange County. That's hundreds of miles away. I don't know what, 400 miles, more than that, 400, 500 miles maybe. Can't remember exactly. I've driven it, but I can't remember it's a long way. So how does a guy like him have such geographic mobility, right? Not just north to south in California and on the Pacific, but he was also in New York, city of New York, upstate New York. He was identified. There's a whole case behind it. I would suggest you buy whatever books there are on the Rodney Alcala case. I read them all, I believe, unless there's a new one, and it'll go into the detail. This is a guy who was of above average intelligence. He graduated with an undergraduate degree in film from UCLA. He was an excellent photographer, but what he did with his photographic ability and equipment was to surreptitiously and also overtly photograph young women and teenagers at the beach. That's where we would hang out. Huntington. This presentation here has a whole section that shows these telephoto portraits of girls. I think they were probably unawares that he was taking these photos, but he would also solicit them, say, I'll pay you X amount of dollars if you'll pose for me, in addition to his other crimes. Now, the point I wanted to make is that while I was watching these photographs that Rodney James Alcala was doing back in the 70s, it reminded me of the type of voyeuristic cinematography of these Roger Corman films. Because remember from a previous talk, I was raising the question whether Roger Corman, the director, producer, distributor, belonged to intelligence. And there was near unanimous agreement that he probably had a connection there. So I went ahead, thanks to my patrons, and got a 2-disc set of 4 of his so-called Nurses series, Roger Corman. And there's all these telephotos, still voyeuristic women, some of them bare-breasted, in bikinis at the beach. It could have been done at Manhattan Beach, Redondo Beach, wherever Rodney James Alcala was hanging out. So you see the distance between your Roger Corman films, the Nurses series of the 70s, roughly 73 to 76, is around the same time that Rodney James Alcala is doing his thing. And these movies, the first one came out in 1973. I put it in a timeline. I said, well, when did the murder of the nurses, the Filipina nurses, take place? Perpetrated by Richard Speck. Well, it was 1967, or 66, rather, I believe. I might have got it wrong. Yeah, 1966. July 14th, 1966. So I'm thinking that because he's one of the original exponents of gore and splatter and horrific movies, torturing women and hunting them down, that's Roger Corman. And he's being lauded by people like Martin Scorsese and Jack Nicholson, who Corman cast in some of his early movies. But somehow Corman has escaped critical attention. How can that be? So I'm putting it out there publicly that we, independent researchers, not the people in film school, and I've taught at the UCLA film school, they don't like to talk about this type of stuff. They want to talk about the art of film. They want to talk about the auteur theory. They want to talk about the premier acting and directorial and writing talent that goes into the American Film Institute version of what cinema is. But I see that cinema, quote unquote, in Hollywood being on the continuum from the features that most of us have grown up on, through the drive-in gore specialties of Roger Corman because it's very much related to automobile culture and the drive-in theater institutions. There are still a few of them around, but they used to be ubiquitous all over the country. He's still alive, Roger Corman. He became a if you're a businessman, if you're making multi-million, good for you. But I'm wondering what the source of the is. I mean, did these movies make that much money? Now, I think there was some serious mind fuckery going on here, social engineering, because there's also a subgenre in the porno business, and this is the point I was trying to make. There's a thin line that divides the mainstream business between the Corman movies, the low budget, and the porno business in the San Fernando Valley, which is all within driving distance, which also would further on the continuum, the so-called, I won't use the word because I might be shut down here, but these are movies that record the ultimate. All right. They're all on a continuum here. I don't see them as distinct genres. I see them as part of a spectrum here. Now, that's what cultural forensics contributes to these types. He's looking at it, importantly, through a forensic science, procedural justice perspective. Yes, we need that. But we also need cultural forensics to get into the deeper motivational why questions. For example, the rhetorical question, which is not so rhetorical in my book, why Rodney James Alcala had this wide geographic sweep. They have a great deal of mobility. Same with Theodore Bundy. Why? It's because if you've been watching my channel, please subscribe at this point. Right? Make me a YouTube celebrity. Subscribe. I've used this phrase, lab leak. These people are lab leaks. Just like COVID-19 was leaked into the civilian population. These people who have been engineered in certain fashions, in a certain manner, right? Whether it's through MKUltra, however you want to characterize it, through environmental, like the author that we talked about a few weeks ago. But the point is that they are not some sort of random one-off product. They're engineered. That's why I call them lab leaks. And again, some of it's environmental, because the people who are most exposed to high concentrations of lead are also the ones who live in the barrio or the ghetto. The Zodiac killer, Richard Ramirez, in the first book, full-scale book on the Zodiac killer, Richard Ramirez, talks about how he was growing up in Texas next to a toxic lead chemical dump. He was brain damaged. And that's why you see a lot of this violent crime coming out of certain ethnic or racial groups who I don't even need to identify, but they sure be beating up white people in yellows and a few browns too. So point is I'm making here is that it's not so much about the race, although they have responsibility on a personal level. It's also about the engineering of this violent core, this subset, this milieu that I'm contributing to this discussion. All right. Another point I want to make is that Matt Murphy, because of his recognized, and he's working on a second book, I believe, because of his demonstrated expertise and his ability to communicate some very, very difficult, gruesome themes, subjects, topics, communicate them to the average person. He's a very important advocate for breaking developments in the so-called criminal injustice system. Specifically, we have the recent resentencing of Lyle and Eric Menendez, otherwise known as the Menendez brothers, who admitted to brutally shotgunning to death, point blank range, their parents, Kitty and Jose Menendez, in Beverly Hills, I believe. Most of you know the story, so I won't go through it. And recently there was an organization called the Innocence Project. The first time I don't know if it's the same organization, but I first heard of the Innocence Project when they brought in experts for the OJ trial saying, hey, this criminalistic stuff might not be valid. So they brought in some people there. They were getting them out of prison because there were people who were unjustly convicted of violent crimes or even murder. Some were even set up. So that's where, I don't know if it's the same organization. This is what you'll have to research. I'm going to check into it myself because I only learned that it was the Innocence Project that helped to fund the resentencing of the Menendez brothers, Lyle and Eric. And by the way, it was Abramson, the attorney. I showed you a clip of her. She's still around. She's 80, 81 years old. She hates Dominic Dunn. Dominic Dunn's dead, but they were enemies. She was the one that started the fashion statement of having violent criminals wearing these little preppy sweaters. That was little Eric and little Lyle, little collegians. Right, and they had Uncle Remus, Sean John Combs, rocking the sympathy sweaters as well, because you're telling a story here. Semiotically, you're telling the story. This is what Matt Murphy has to go up against. And this book has interesting details, like he wears Alan Edmonds shoes. These are not super expensive shoes, but they're quality, all leather construction made in the USA. How do I know? Because I'm a fan of Alan Edmonds shoes myself. I have many pairs I haven't opened up yet because I'm storehousing them, because eventually they're not going to be made in America anymore. Anyway, that's a second point. So this is what Matt Murphy is doing now, not post-career in the DA's office, is he's acting, I believe, he's not saying this himself, but the way I view him is that he is acting as a public advocate for people who don't want to see Lyle and Eric Menendez being paroled, because the resentencing is a gateway to future parole. So Harry is explaining to some supposedly a legal correspondent to one of the networks.
Yes, has confronted some of the darkest crimes in modern history, taking on some of America's most sadistic serial killers, solving no-body murder cases, and bringing justice for victims and families in cold cases. After working 17 years as a homicide prosecutor in Orange County, he writes about those experiences in The Book of Murder, A Prosecutor's Journey Through Love and Death. Please welcome my friend Matt Murphy. 17 years is a long time doing that kind of work. We were talking about it just a few moments ago, but since this is The View, let's start with some hot topics, okay? The Menendez brothers were found guilty of the killing of their parents in 1989. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Last month, though, Los Angeles DA George Gascon said he would recommend a resentencing for the brothers. The situation, though, may have just become more complicated. So why don't you tell us the latest developments in the case?
So essentially what happened was there was new evidence that came to light, quote unquote new evidence. One involved a letter written by Eric Menendez.
Yes.
And so there's two.
To his cousin, right?
to his cousin, supposedly. It's undated and it's a little bit vague what's in there.
Okay.
There's two different paths legally the defense can take. They can do what's called a habeas petition, where essentially the standard is the jury would have reached a different verdict with that evidence, which is kind of a high bar, or the DA can recommend resentencing. And that's a recommendation that the court does not have to accept. Now, what happened in the meantime was the habeas sat on George Gascon, he's the outgoing DA. It sat on his desk for 18 months, and they basically took no action. Then came this new sort of 11th hour appeal for resentencing, and he agreed to recommend that they be resentenced, but then he lost the election to a man named Nathan Hochman, who I know, by 30 points. And Gascon came out very publicly saying he wanted to resentence the Menendez brothers. And Hochman said he didn't think that was appropriate. So the voters of Los Angeles just sent Gascon packing by probably the largest margin in any election we've had for DA in Los Angeles County.
Is it your sense that the voters, that was sort of a referendum on what Gascon was recommending?
You know, as a small part, Gascon was he was almost an experimental DA in a way. He was the former DA of San Francisco. He came down and enacted a series of policies that were deeply unpopular in Los Angeles.
Well, let me ask you this then, because there.
You can tell Matt Murphy knows the inner politics of someone like Jorge Gascon. He's awful. He's terrible. It's because of people like Matt Murphy who says this character, and he's out of his official capacity as an assistant DA, so he can say publicly what he feels. But Gascon is part of this revolution to subvert the United States of America. He comes out of San Francisco. For all I know, he's a DACA baby, deferred action against illegal immigrant chillins. Those are the ones who you see demonstrating in the streets now. This is what happens. These are the ones who are being catered to at my previous place of employment, University of California, Davis, with a multi-million-dollar building dedicated to DACA babies, because they're going to be filling these positions to further put all Americans, not just yellows like me, but everybody, back into the electro hacienda system, which Junipero Serra had the Indians into all up and down the state of California. It was the mission system. We're now going to be in the techno-missionary system, thanks to probably trained by the Jesuits, Jorge Gascon. I'm going to look at his credentials. I'm going to look at his background. I want to make sure, see where he pops up. Just as I do any of these other Latino people, the burrocats or the Latinas or Latinx who are being pushed up on the American public, like Alejandro Ocasio-Cortez. We yellow people are not going to put up with that bullshit. And I hope no Americans in their right minds do either, including black people, because they're the ones who are being whiplashed the most in all of this. So Matt Murphy has come against this decision quite publicly, which is his prerogative now as a private citizen. He's in private practice now. He now is a defense attorney. That's not an unusual career path for former prosecutor. I'm not going to hold that against him. If I ever get in trouble, I'm going to dial up Matt Murphy, because I know he'll be a bulldog in court. Just like the people who defended John Combs, those people were bulldogs. They came out of these second-tier law schools, and they know how to fight. They're knife fighters. Okay, they're not the law professor types, but James Comey, the ones from the elite school. These are the ones who have put in the years at the DA's office, the prosecutor's office. So I'm just telling you this because a lot of us, including myself, feel put upon by the justice system, or what we call the injustice system. We're frustrated. But I'm telling you, and then we can't relax. I'm not saying that. But there are people out there who are looking after the larger system and are voicing their informed, experienced opinion against people like Jorge Gascon. He's also the guy who overlooked the fact that there were 3 yellow people who were chopped up by some Hollywood producer's son. He don't care about no yellow people. Neither did the Zodiac killer, Richard Ramirez. He targeted yellow people. Then he got the training from his uncle, Miguel Ramirez, when they were living in Tejas, being exposed to lead and all sorts of chemical poisoning. Uncle Miguel went to Vietnam and killed himself some gooks. And he brought the Polaroid pictures to show young Richard Ramirez about gook women with a 45 pointed into their whores pointed against their heads just before he offed them. And I mention this because there's a heavy, unspoken militaristic connection between these types of violent mass murders and serial killers. I wrote it in an academic journal, New Political Science, back in 2002. It's called Empire of Death. Check it out. You find it. I'll post it again to my Patreon. That is my definitive statement of where this mess is coming from. It's coming from the soil. So we have the injustice of the Menendez brothers who at point blank range shot their parents in the face and are going to be walking amongst us. And they're going to have tons of female admirers. Oh, Eric, please marry me. I'm a hybristophiliac. I love true crime. I read all the Catherine Ramsland. I read all the women who write and are on YouTube talking about these serial killers. I'm sure Brian Koberger is getting all kinds of MASH letters in solitary. So people like Matt Murphy are one of the bricks in the wall standing against this type of societal sickness that bleeds up from the soil of American empire. So we move to a more recent case, that of one Scott Peterson. Do you remember that one? I do, because I used to live in Emeryville. This is in the Bay Area. It's between Berkeley and Oakland. It's a little spit of land called Emeryville. And there's the Berkeley Marina, there's a fishing area. I used to drive by there all the time to get on the freeway, the I-80, to go to UC Davis. When I was living there, I didn't see it. The commute was too much for me. But I know that area where Scott Peterson threw his pregnant wife, Lacey Peterson, and her unborn child overboard and weighed her down with concrete. Now there's talk, thanks to the Innocent Project, so-called, there's talk about resentencing Scott Peterson so that he can get out. So on and on it goes. And by the way, the irony is that it's because of these improved methods of finding DNA and genetic material, the CODIS is the acronym for it, is that they're able to say, hey, listen, that's not X's blood. This is contaminated. It's so powerful, it's picking up anybody that's touched or sat on or brushed up against a certain item, whether it's a pillow, clothes, whatever it might be. Could be a scabbard of a knife. So this is what the Innocence Project is arguing in the case of Scott Peterson. He's about one of the most abhorrent people you could ever imagine. I followed that case very closely. For one thing, he's not from far. Him and his family, his expectant family, because this is his first child. lived not far from where I am, Stockton, California, Central California, south of me. And he used to go fishing over into the Bay Area. I think he bought a new boat about 2 weeks before he murdered Lacey Peterson. He was getting, I can say that he murdered because he was convicted of it, of the crime. God. And I also read the books by his lover, Amber Fry. I think that's how you pronounce her name. She talked about him. He was a playboy, Scott Peter. I mean, every nasty thing you can think about. And this is before TikTok and the dating apps, man. People had to do it the hard way. I don't know where he was meeting. He probably went to bars and met women and lied, say, yeah, I'm a single man, you know. The only thing that was true about him is that he was a fertilizer salesman, because that's what he was serving up to all the women that he was trying to date, even though he had a pregnant wife at home. So there's material on the case if you want some more specifics. So he doesn't, Matt Murphy doesn't talk about that case here because he didn't try it. He only talks about the cases that he was directly involved, but he's commenting on it now. And hopefully people like Matt Murphy are conditioning the ideological environment, let's call it, to ensure that these people are not being put back in public. I mean, I think, you know, I may be alone here, but, you know, I want to see someone like Sean John Combs do some time. I want to see Ghislaine Maxwell. I want to see her do some time. Serious time. And Scott Peterson, who murdered his own wife and unborn child. Wow. I want to see him do some time, to put it light. Anyway, here's Matt Murphy offering his expert opinion on that developing case.
Parent company Comcast, the 51-year-old gives his own version of events from behind prison walls. In interviews done over an entire year, Peterson, appearing in good health with longer hair, continues to maintain his innocence and is confident in ongoing efforts to free him.
There's no forensic evidence. There's nothing to tie him to the murder.
Peterson was sentenced to death in 2004 for the 2002 murders of his wife Lacey and their unborn son Connor after their bodies washed up in San Francisco Bay, near where Peterson said he'd gone fishing months earlier.
She trusted her husband, and he betrayed her.
In the Netflix docuseries American Murder, Lacey Peterson, Lacey's at the center of the story. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, speaking out for the first time in years about Peterson's conviction.
I can't say we were all excited and happy about it. That's not the feeling that I had at all. Just a relief.
Also speaking out, Peterson's former girlfriend, Amber Fry, whose decision to come forward about their relationship helped prosecutors establish a motive.
On the stand, I wasn't just sitting there alone, but I was sitting there for Lacey and her unborn child.
In face-to-face, Peterson admits his affair with Fry was a terrible mistake, saying he withheld that information from police to focus on finding Lacey. In 2020, California's Supreme Court overturned Peterson's death sentence, citing jury selection errors by the trial judge, and resentenced him to life without parole. He was denied a new trial in 2022. Now backed by the LA Innocence Project, Peterson is trying again.
So let's pick it up there. What are the next steps as Peterson tries to get this new trial?
We'll leave it there, right there for now. I have to wind this up, and I'll leave you with some further thoughts on the University of Idaho student murders up there. There's still quite a bit of interest. I've been watching the social media and whatnot, and some of the commentary. There's still a lot of interest in it. I don't think the interest in the case is flagging. It's probably growing because, and it's going to grow more as certain anomalies start to reassert themselves. I'm already starting to, I'm not going to share any of the links with you today, but maybe in a future date, I will do so. But my own original assessment is that, look, I always look at the cultural forensics of any type of situation, whether it's a crime or not, just in general. I look at cultural and society and mine it for nuggets, let's say, right? In this case, I know that Idaho, what is now the state of Idaho, used to be part of the state of Washington. They were all part of this larger Northwest territories, I guess you can call it. Had a history of violence, but against native peoples, especially the Nez Perce, or some people call Nez Perce tribe. You might have read about Chief Joseph when you were in grade school, Chief Joseph. And I only learned this recently, but he was a convert to Christianity, and they still screwed him over. They still wanted to put him on the reservation, and they still wanted to exterminate his people. So you have this going back into the middle of the 19th century, further on with the despoliation for the miners and everything else that's going on, mass burials of Chinese workers, right, who were miners. They were in the lumber industry, extractive industry, the railroads, the unmarked grave. I mean, there's a whole history of it, right? I'm just giving you the milieu, let's call it. In addition to that, this whole area is a very popular destination for U.S. military veterans. And I don't want to cast aspersions on them as a group. I'm just telling you demographically, there are a lot of veterans, because many of them, understandably so, don't want to have anything to do with the central government, state, local, or federal, let alone New World Order. So you've got some of these people up there in Coeur d'Alene, up in Boise, and in Moscow, and all the other cities around there. In addition to that, you have from what I've now learned, you have a robust trade in drugs, methamphetamine, cocaine, marijuana. Of course, you can grow it anywhere. And I can assume that there's probably, quote unquote, cartels involved. And when there are cartels involved, there's government and police and military complicity. You know this. If you're watching my channel, you have studied Mena, Arkansas. You've looked at the whole Clinton operation. You've looked all the way back to the origins of Yale University and the opium trade, and Harvard and Columbia. You know about that. I'm not telling you anything new. You think it ended after the book came out? But no. The business model is still very much in operation. So we have the setting for an atrocity event that's there. And I'm focusing in more. I'm not going to elaborate too much because I'm already way over my self-allotted time. These are really good books. It's a series by Osprey Publications. It's published in Britain, I believe, the UK. And this is called U.S. McVie-SOG, Reconnaissance Team in Vietnam. And what this is assassination squads, trained assassination squads that work with the Central Intelligence Agency that were sent over to Vietnam to kill gooks. Right? Read the Phoenix program by Douglas Valentine. That's the single volume explication of that whole system. And you can find smaller books like this with excellent photographs, historical renderings, artists. This is not speculative. This is real research. This is not some pop-up pundit whipping up material and putting out for public consumption. This is real military science, military history. So you get that going on. And yes, those people who have training up there like that, they're very well acquainted with not just firearms, but bladed edged weapons, let's call them. Whether it's the Gerber knives, sure, the K-bar, there's all different sorts of models that are up there. Very well acquainted with that type of stuff. And the crime scene seems to have the earmarks of these types of slaughters that were reported in Vietnam. You've heard about the My Lai massacre, right? There were many such massacres in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos during one of the many wars that the United States have been waging against yellow people. Now they're concentrating on browns right now, but historically it's been the yellow people. That's why you don't see any people like me out on TV unless they're gay. George Takei. Because if they're gay, they're supposedly harmless. And another book I can refer to you is something I just found in my shelves as I was prepping. Can't read it, too much illumination. It says Shadow Warrior, subtitled William Egan Colby and the CIA. William Colby, who, as most of you know, turned up drowned in the river in Maryland on his canoe. You know the story. Because he was spilling what they call the family jewels to his higher ups, and they killed him too. He was one of the architects of SOG at McVie. There's a whole section in here. I earmarked it later. I'm going to copy it down and cite it from my own research. Colby. And his son later on made a documentary about his father, Carl Colby, who was a leftist. So anyway, I hope I'm getting my point across is that there's a whole history, or more immediately cultural forensics, behind this panorama of mayhem that we're seeing here. And none of the pop-up pundits or the indie people, even the long-established ones like Ashley Banfield, will go near it because it involves the very engine, the motor, the heart of darkness itself, the Pentagon, and its master, NATO. Now, to conclude, this is kind of a sidebar, but I found this book. It's called The Boys of Boise. This is a book about the sex scandal. You've heard about the Franklin scandal, right? There's a lot of material on that. Well, there was a similar scandal up there out of Boise, Idaho. You think, wow, those people are so clean cut, pure living people living up in nature. But it turns out the whole state government was infiltrated by a homosexual underground. And the author says, hey, that's nothing to be panicked about. That's how the world works. But wait, there's more. I studied with this guy. See, I've been around so long that I've been here, I've been there. I can tell you about these experiences because I've been through them. I lived through them. But I took a course with John Gerassi, who, by the way, was the adopted son of Jean-Paul Sartre, because Gerassi Sr., he was, I think he was in the Maquis. He was in the resistance, French resistance. He was murdered by the Nazis. So the younger boy, was adopted by the great philosopher. This is what we were told. We whisper. We were in grad school, right? At UC Irvine, over the hill from Newport Beach, over the hill from Balboa, over the hill from where all the rich people live, over in Fashion Island and South Coast Plaza. So yeah, Tito Gerassi, John Gerassi. But I didn't know that he wrote this book about the gay underground in Boise, Idaho. So I know, yeah, this took place in the 50s. That tells me there's more research, or what I call cultural forensics, that need to be performed so we can have a better understanding of what really went down on that night, that dark, cold winter night in Moscow, Idaho. That's my time, ladies and gentlemen. I went from the Filipino nurses of Chicago with Richard Speck, the transsexuals, all the way to 2025 Brian Koberger. Now that's what I call scope. That's what I call breadth and depth. I only have an hour and a half, but I tried my best. The only way for me to get really into it, I'm going to have to write about this in book form so I can really, really delve into it. But until then, ladies and gentlemen, I'll see you next Sunday with some new exciting insights for you. Thank you very much for your attention. I do appreciate your support and your taking the time to watch this important talk. See you next Sunday, God willing. Peace.